Dear colleagues, thank you so much for sacrificing such a beautiful day and coming to listen to my talk. I'm afraid to disappoint you after such praise or constructive criticism, which I heard from you. You know, it's a great honor and responsibility to talk about the hegemony of cultural nationalism and defining it. So what I'm going, first of all, I'm very grateful for inviting me to beautiful Regensburg, and I'm happy to be here and see the colleagues, and some of them are authors for my journals, and hope that after our dialogues and talks, probably more people will like to contribute to the 3 journals. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk is based on the special issue of New Literary Observer, which was recently published, dealing with the constructing cultural identity in diasporas. And it's not so much a statement, but raising a number of questions dealing with the topic of the present conference. The major problem about the past and confrontation of histories is that, unlike other cultural activities and artistic activities like literature, performing arts, many other things, which became democratized many years ago, that's us speaking not about kings and queens, but about people. I think history in general, in spite of all the efforts, it's still dealing with the history of kingdoms, empires, or national states. That's why I think the problem of defying cultural nationalism, whenever we try to do it, it's a kind of booby trap, because we still end at the same categories and paradigms. In order to deal with the problem, I think there's a huge need for intellectual community to define new concepts, new paradigms for studying human history. And as you can see, that in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, after the failure of this grand narrative, discreditation of great narratives, there was a new intellectual and academic trends appearing. And if you look at all of them, all this anthropological term in humanities and social studies, for instance, nowadays it's social anthropology, historical anthropology, philosophical anthropology, everything dealing with anthropology. If you look at feminist studies, post-colonial studies, oral history, history and theory of affects, body studies, you can see these are the different attempts to form this as a new paradigm, worldview, and concept of history, which could explain diversity of human existence. And I think that's one of the most interesting intellectual trends which exist for the last 30 years, perhaps. It's the so-called diaspora studies. It started in the late 70s, and the 4 founding fathers were Hajik Toloyan, William Safran, Robin Cohen, Yoshi Shine, and many others. And of course, the notion of diasporas are well known for many years because of the Jewish diasporas. And there were quite a lot of migrants during the last 2 or 3 centuries. But especially after the war, with these new legislations and this huge migration of people, it became evident that diasporas, or the ethnic communal unities living all around the world, it's not some kind of a strange and subnormal notion, but a very important phenomena which should be studied. And in 1991, a journal, Diaspora, with the subtitle, A Journal of Transnational Studies, appeared. I think that was the beginning of the true new discipline. In interdisciplinary group, one never knows what people really are aware about or not. That's why it's very difficult. I don't know whether to describe it in a more detailed way or just give some samples of these new emerging disciplines. But it started and continues with this huge discussion how you can define contemporary diaspora. In the first issue of Diaspora Journal, William Safran gave the first detailed description on diaspora based on the so-called paradigmatic Jewish diaspora, at least how it existed for many centuries. I'll just give these 6 notions of the diaspora. So first, they or their ancestors has been dispersed from a special original center to 2 or more peripheral or foreign regions. Second, they retain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland, its physical location, history, and achievements. They believe that they are not fully accepted by their host society, and therefore feel partly alienated and insulated from it. Fourth, they regard their ancestral homeland as their true ideal home, and as the place to which they or their descendants will eventually return. They believe that they should collectively be committed to the maintenance or restoration of their original homeland and to its safety and prosperity. And the last one, they continue to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another. And their ethnic communal consciousness and solidarity are importantly defined by the existence of such a relationship. You know, that was the first definition. And after that, for the last 25 years up till now, there's a huge debate how you can really define it, whether it's the true description or not. Because nowadays, of course, if you look at all these 6 points, none of the diasporas will fit into this canon. Even the present Jewish diaspora, which is now dissolving in many countries. And so there are quite a lot of other theories. For instance, Robin Cohen presented an alternative typology of diasporas. He proposed to divide it into 5 items: that victimized, working, trade, imperial, and cultural. I would say Kim Butler introduced a historical and temporal factor. She said that people in diaspora should live at least in 2 generations, otherwise you can't consider it diaspora. And Hedrick Toller was quite sure that you can't include working and trade migrants into diaspora, because the very meaning of diaspora is a cultural trauma of being expelled or leaving your homeland. And so this trauma is the conceptual core of commemorative practices. You know, we can discuss this for hours because, you know, diasporization of the world is a moving target. But what is very interesting and I think very productive as a kind of possible way of overcoming nationalistic national history, history of the empire, national states. It's the way how present-day diasporas defy the major notions of national state. Well, of course, we understand that the idea of nation-state is quite a new construct which appeared in the early 19th century, and still it's a working concept. So it's interesting that's how many scholars who really studied diasporas found out very interesting features in many diasporas. First of all, if we look at the very concept of homeland, or motherland, and you understand for the concept of national state, it's a sacred notion in a way. If you don't have your homeland, you're nothing. Your national identity, your personal identity is mostly based on the idea of homeland, and that's why the trauma of leaving the land, living somewhere, it's such an important thing for a diaspora. But if you look closely at what's going on in these ethnic communal unities outside homelands, it's an interesting case. For instance, Anna Karutyina, who studies Armenian diaspora in Germany, she pointed out that if you look at the Armenians who came from Turkey to Germany after the Second World War, because still there was a great community there after genocide, and in Turkey they felt as diaspora really, living in the quite hostile country. So they came to Germany, and it's appeared suddenly that their hybrid multiple identity includes 3 visions of homeland. Of course, this is the lost paradise, this is Armenia before genocide. Then the present-day Armenian republics, which somehow they never visited, but still it existed somewhere. And strangely enough, Turkey, which is dominant for their consciousness, because really that was their homeland for many generations. And so what she sees and concludes of every possibilities to combine these hybrid identities without any inner conflict. And more than that, she produces an alternative vision of idea of a homeland. And she said, probably we should get away with the idea of motherland, but instead we can introduce, say, the concept of emotional places, local places where people live, where they are brought up, and it's not necessarily can be identified with the whole country where they lived in. I'll say another example, I think comes from the scholar Brian Axon, who's studying six diasporas around the world. And just the core of their emotional life is this utopian vision of Kurdistan, a sacred land which has never existed. As you know, that Hindus are persecuted in India, and quite a lot of them left the country, living all around the world. And interestingly enough, that there is no such land and never existed. So the diaspora itself somehow invented the homeland. So Brian Axel concludes that in some diasporas, many diasporas, homeland exists not geographically, but inside the diaspora itself. So in a way, the diasporas invade, create the homeland themselves. So I think that undermines the very essence of nation states as a kind of sacred land and at the core of one's identity. Another, I would say, sacred whale of the nation-state concept is, of course, language for many countries. Even in empires like Russia, the Soviet Union, where it was multinational, it is multinational, multilingual country, still there was idea of this major language, Russian language, as a kind of lingua franca for everyone in a way. I think that's a very important thing. And usually we know that the loss of your native language is associated with catastrophe. But in a way, what happens in different diasporas all around the world and what's going on with language and identity. Interesting to say that friend Andy Byford, the British scholar, who wrote a book about the Russian diaspora in Great Britain, he concludes, studying the forging of the Russian diaspora in the Great Britain, saying that because of people who come to the Great Britain are coming from different regions and from different ethnic groups, Russian language does not fit into the canon. So it's not enough for such different people with different backgrounds to feel like a community. And in a very strange way, so this the merging of the Russian diasporical imagination comes not through language or some, more traditional ways, say culture, but through performances. Andy Byford uses Erwin Goffman's theory of social interaction and Victor Turner's anthropology of performance, and showing all the strange performances on Trafalgar Square, all the strange nobility balls, in London, in a way. This is the way, the very way how the community, is trying to find this, the core of identity. And it creates itself through performance and during the performance. So in a way, strange, language has nothing to do with it. The other example, it's Andrea Warner, who explores different strategies of the former Russian writers going abroad. And he shows that somehow language is also not a problem for them. And many of them, like Kaminer in Germany, Larry Steingart and many other in the United States, they started writing in the languages of the host country. But strangely enough, they use and sometimes abuse so-called Russishness in their works, mostly stereotypes in a way, but still presented them as Russian writers, but writing not in Russian, but in different languages. So in this case, again, this contemporary diasporas defy this idea of language as the only or the major kernel of personal collective identity. Another way, it's religion. For many countries, religion still continues to be kind of a very important factor. And one of the most interesting examples is this, what happens to many immigrants leaving countries and how they define their religiousness. I would say David Layton, who is doing quite a lot of work dealing with this religious consciousness. He wrote a wonderful article about the cosmopolitization of the Russian diaspora in New York and Israel, and comparing it. And the irony consists in the way that when the Russian Jews in the 70s and 80s created the so-called inner diaspora, that's creating these horizontal ties and inventing their Jewishness because of the anti-Semitism in Russia, and leaving Russia either for America to Israel, somehow chose absolutely different strategies. And the true religious Jews going to Israel suddenly became cosmopolitans there and became Russians instead of Jews. And it's not because somehow of any pressure, but they suddenly realized because of the political situation in Israel dictated that if they become Jews, there will be no privileges. But if you become Russian there, you become part of political force, opposition political force. So somehow that was flexibility of their religious consciences was quite striking. On the other hand, the Russian Jews going to America, who were cosmopolitans, suddenly realized that the status of a Russianness is very low in America. So they started becoming religious Jews, because the religious diaspora in America is very strong and can support it. So in this way, as we understand, religion in a way becomes a part of political trade, so to say. Ethnicity, which I think that's a very important concept for national states, it's becoming very problematic. More than that, I would say that ethnicity becomes very dangerous while talking about the relationship between diaspora and, I would say, homeland, real homeland. And I would pay your attention to two very important articles in our special issue. One is by Catherine Clark, which is a well-known scholar. She wrote an article dealing with the German intellectuals who fled from the Nazi Germany into Soviet Union in the 30s, and who tried to create their new identity, opposed to the Nazi identity of blood and soil. So they used the idea of culture in the notion of the late Enlightenment, like Goethe, Fichte, the brothers Humboldt, so creating this idea of progressive nationalism based on culture and world culture as well. So in this way, it was not only national but more international. And the other article dealing with the dangers of ethnicity and playing with diasporic imagination, it's by James Castile, who investigated how Hitler used this idea of transnational folk identity to invade Russia, because, you know, the major topic was that in Russia, the Germans who lived there from the 18th century, invited by Catherine the Great, so somehow in a very poor condition, and so there were some atrocities against them in a way. So this is idea of this national body, of ethnic body, which which goes beyond the borders of the nation state. So this created quite a dangerous precedent. And in this way, if you look at quite a lot of diasporas all over the world, ethnicity doesn't play so much a role, but more it plays them dealing with the previous topics. And of course, speaking about culture, which is most enigmated topic as well. You know, and what is really preserved in the diasporas, because the usual thing that somehow when the diaspora emerge, they have to preserve all this cultural tradition which they bring there from the homeland. So it's a kind of deposit of cultural values. But the interesting thing is that somehow the problematization of the idea of culture is also here. You know, if you compare several waves of Russian emigration during the 20th century, especially the first immigration, the third and the fourth, in a way there were quite a lot of funny incidents, you know, that's a representative of one culture, and you could guess that people coming in waves during the century would create a kind of huge diaspora. But it never happened. Probably the closest diaspora to this paradigmatic diaspora defined by William Safran was the first wave of immigrants who really created diasporic communities because they really wanted to come back and hope for that. But I remember a funny story told me by late Vasily Aksyonov, a very famous Russian writer, who was one of the immigrants of the third waves. And so there's a group of writers and intellectuals and rights activists in New York. And he told me that once they were invited to some party, and they met just the remnants of this first emigration, so these very old people of nobility sitting somewhere in the corner. And that was the group of rather young people from the Soviet Union who come in there. And so there was no interaction between them. And the feeling was that they belonged to different cultures altogether, was prevailing, which was true. And so the funny thing was that when the host and hostess asked them to go to the table, one of the group, I don't remember who was there, decided to be polite to these old people, you know, sitting somewhere. So he came up to this, the remnants of the White Guard, and said, "Товарищи, товарищи, comrades, let's go to the table." I would say that is a funny thing, but in a way, this is a tragic thing, showing there is no such things of mutual heritage. That somehow people speaking the same language belong to absolutely different diasporas. In this sense, you know, defining culture is always a great problem. Probably I will stop now here, and probably your question will help me to explain many things which I omitted. The last thing that I wanted to mention, to stress out, my example showed that diasporas are very inventive and creative. And suddenly they are not this closed or semi-closed society, you know, guarding some, you know, aesthetic values which sometimes lost in their homeland, but creating the life of their own and being quite independent of the homeland, even creating their own homeland if they wish. And so it's difficult to really define, to pin up them, because they develop all the time. But a very interesting historical example is based on a survey. Duchess Wrangel, who was the mother of the famous Wrangel brothers, after the revolution, being in exile, she sent a questionnaire all around the world, asking immigrants to answer them, to see the, to create this idea of Russishness, of Russian identity, and who can be considered a true Russian. And interestingly enough, there are quite a lot of different answers to that. But the conclusion was that instead of preserving, I would say, pre-revolutionary ideas of Russianness, which were based on language and religion, first of all, this trauma of civil war and revolution produced absolutely different way of defining Russianness. It was based on political ideas. So many people were excluded, especially Jews and people of other ethnic groups, because they were supposed to be sympathetic to Bolsheviks. In a way, it's ended, this questionnaire ended with a sort of disappointed by Duchess, because it was impossible to define who is true Russian nowadays, I mean in the 20s. Probably I'll stop here and say that diaspora studies, I think it's not the answer to all the questions, but probably a good opportunity to look beyond national state boundaries. And as one of the scholars said, that probably in future we'll see history not as glorification of deeds and misdeeds of certain territories, but as a conglomerate of overlapping diasporization.